Hello everyone, Swanee here, and yesterday, Helldivers 2 dropped both a brand new balancing patch and a new Warbond trailer. And since then, I've tested out all the latest changes in yesterday's patch, and in today's video, I'm going to give you guys a quick rundown of my thoughts on those changes. So no need to beat around the bush, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So first up is the secondary Plas-15 Loyalist. It had its starting magazines increased from 2 to 3, and spare magazines increased from 4 to 5. Now, I already thought this was one of the best secondary weapons in the game, and now, obviously, it's even better. The increased ammo will make short work of large groups of enemies like the Voteless or Terminid bug breaches. It's also a lot better now at taking out those medium tier enemies like heavy devastators or overseers now without it burning through an entire magazine. There isn't really too much more to say about this weapon. I mean, it was already good, it got buffed, and now it's really good. So if you were a fan of this weapon before, now you're going to like it even better. Next up is the TX41 Sterilizer. They removed the crosshair drift recoil, decreased the camera climb recoil, and the duration of the gas status effect was increased from 6 seconds to 10 seconds. Now, I was super excited for this change because I always wanted the Sterilizer to be on par with the flamethrower, and unfortunately, I still don't think that's the case. Now, don't get me wrong, those extra few seconds of the gas effect is nice when the enemies are running around like crazy, but the issue with this thing is still the range. When you hit an enemy with a flamethrower up close, they just straight up die. But with the Sterilizer, the range is about the same as the flamethrower, except the gas doesn't straight up kill the enemies, it just makes them go into a frenzy. So when you're up that close, they'll just end up running straight into your face and they can still easily kill you. So I tried the Sterilizer out against all three factions, and it did best against the Terminids, and it did okay against the Illuminate as long as you don't have a million of those elevated overseers flying around you, because the range just is still awful. And when you shoot the overseers with the gas, they just don't really seem to care that they're affected by the gas, and I've noticed that those overseers just kind of ignore the gas effect and will just shoot you anyway. And it still pretty much sucks against the Automatons because they'll just shoot you in the face while you're trying to get up close to them. So although the Sterilizer did get a buff, I still don't feel like it's enough of a buff, and I feel like they need to slightly buff the range on this thing in my opinion. So they definitely made it better, it's just not on par with the flamethrower. Next up are all the mines. The anti-personnel mines, incendiary mines, and anti-tank mines all got their cooldowns decreased from 180 seconds to 120 seconds, which is pretty big. This helps cut off certain objectives or choke points a lot quicker than before, and I found that this helps a lot with those raise the flag missions or defending extraction with how often you can call them in. The incendiary mines got a buff to damage from 210 to 300, and the anti-personnel mines got a buff from 350 to 700 damage. And they both got a buff to their spread by 20% to minimize the risk of chain explosions to avoid setting them all off at once. That's always been a huge problem with the mines, is you'll have like one individual unit set off one mine and then the whole minefield goes off, and it was kind of a waste. So this definitely helps with that a little bit. Now, I could immediately tell a huge difference with the mines, and I personally really like them now. You're still going to run into the issue of team killing and accidentally killing yourself on occasion, but as long as you pay attention, these can be pretty deadly, especially on those defense missions where you want to cut off entryways and sit back and wait for the enemies to come to you. And overall, I think the mines are a pretty decent choice now, and I think a lot more people will probably consider bringing them. Now we just have to wait for those gas mines to finally make a return. I've been waiting for those to come out for a while, and those are going to be pretty deadly with these new mine changes. Next up is the Ballistic Shield backpack. It got a buff so that it can now block melee attacks until the shield takes enough damage and breaks. And I think this change is awesome. I got myself into some pretty crazy situations with this thing against the Voteless and the Terminids. Now that they're giving us more melee weapons, having a shield that can block melee attacks makes melee builds a lot more fun and actually pretty reliable. Up to this point, melee builds were always kind of dumb and weren't really worth it. You had to make your whole build around using a melee weapon, and the risk wasn't ever really worth the reward. But with this change, now it kind of is. You can legit have really good melee builds using the Ballistic Shield now. Just make sure you bring something that can take out those annoying ranged enemies. So being able to block an entire horde worth of enemies, like I was cornered against the Voteless and was just taking tons and tons of hits, like you can just stand there and block and poke, and it was a ton of fun. So if you're into melee builds and you're into just smacking everything with a stick, I think this is definitely a change that a lot of people are going to appreciate. The next buff from yesterday's update comes to the Guard Dog Dog Breath. It has been reworked to increase its effectiveness and to ensure that it remains distinct, focusing on its unique gas-based mechanics. It will now preserve ammo by only prioritizing enemies unaffected by the gas status effect. And once an enemy is affected by the gas, the drone will now move on and target another unaffected enemy. The targeting logic has been reworked to prevent the drone from roaming too far. The origin of the targeting will be from the Helldiver's position rather than the drone itself. And then the duration of the gas status effect for spray weapons has been increased from 6 to 10 seconds. So, after my testing, I do think that the dog breath is definitely way better. In some cases, if you're standing up high or you're hiding behind cover, you can just sit back and the dog breath will go out and take care of most of the enemies for you. It's actually kind of interesting to sit back and watch it only target enemies that don't have the gas effect, and then as soon as that gas effect wears off on them, it'll go spray them some more. So it does a great job of constantly keeping that gas effect on enemies. So let's say, for example, you're in like a 1v1 with a charger. That charger will always stay confused because it's going to be constantly getting sprayed with the gas. I found that it works best against the Terminids for some reason. It'll take out an entire large group solo if you let it. It'll go in and just make quick work of Terminids. I don't know why it does such a good job against the Terminids in particular, but for some reason it didn't do so good against the Illuminate. Now I figured it would kick butt against the Voteless, but I found that it mainly just gets confused, especially when the elevated overseers show up. Since the dog breath has that extended range now, I found that it'll just try to chase down those jetpack guys and it'll just waste time trying to shoot them instead of all the guys that are right up in your face. Then against the Automatons, it's kind of meh. I mean, you don't really want to get too close up and personal with the Automatons, but I did find that it was a little useful when you're trying to charge into an Automaton base. Like if you're really aggressive against the Automatons, then, you know, it's a decent choice. I mean, it's not useless against them. I just don't think it's as good as the other two guard dogs when facing up against the Automatons. But overall, I definitely think it's better than what it was before this update. It can just get a little confused sometimes when it focuses on one individual enemy. Like when you're facing the Voteless, it'll just shoot one Voteless at a time. I wish it just dispersed a big, large cloud of smoke instead of focusing on one individual enemy, but that's just a small complaint. I definitely think it's better. If you weren't a fan of the guard dog breath before, I definitely think it's at least worth checking out now. Next up are changes to the FRV. The patch note says that Helldivers have now been authorized to deploy grenades and stratagems while leaning out of the FRV. They tuned the FRV handling for better driving experiences when cornering, and after testing the FRV, it definitely feels way better at handling now. It's not perfect, and it still feels clunky, but it's at least a lot more manageable. Before this update, driving the FRV felt like you were just always on ice no matter what the terrain was. Going around corners, I would always slide into things and I would flip over the vehicle, and now that's not really the case. I was able to take some pretty sharp turns at full speed without flipping over, so that's definitely nice, and I think it still needs some tweaks going forward. It's not perfect, but you'll definitely notice a big difference the next time you drive this thing. And then as for using stratagems while you're in it, it's kind of neat, I guess. It feels awkward to do so, though, especially if you're playing with a controller. You have to hold down the trigger to hold yourself outside of the vehicle, and then while you're holding down the trigger, you also have to hold in the bumper to then bring up your stratagem menu, and then you have to type in the command. So it just feels weird in your hands when you're using the controller to do that. But it's definitely a lot more fun now when you're driving by and you have all your teammates just chucking stratagems at things on the go. It's definitely a cool upgrade. You can even do this as a solo player, which is nice too. There was a couple times where I was driving solo and then I switched to the passenger seat, threw a stratagem at the nearby objective, and then I switched back into the driver's seat and then drove away. So these ended up being some pretty cool changes, and I hope that the FRV keeps evolving like this going forward. Next up is a small change, but you can now jog when carrying bombs or explosive barrels. This is actually really nice now, and you don't have to constantly spam, the drop button and picking it back up over and over again. You can simply just jog. So now it's not super annoying anytime you have to load up the SEAF artillery. So I definitely think this is a pretty good quality of life change, and you're going to notice a big difference next time you try to pick up a barrel or something. And then lastly, there are two secret changes that made it into the patch that weren't mentioned in the patch notes, and that's the new Bile Titan holes and the new shovel. Now, the new Bile Titan holes are pretty scary, to be honest. People wanted more of a challenge on those harder difficulties, and adding this one new bug hole can make it a lot harder if you don't close it right away. If you go near the Mega Hive nest and you don't close the hole right away, you can very quickly be overwhelmed with like 8 Bile Titans. So I recommend closing this hole as a top priority whenever you see one. And I think this is definitely a pretty cool change. It switches things up a bit. It makes the game a lot harder without adding a whole new difficulty. And I hope they do more things like this in the future to make the game harder. The game can get harder without adding a difficulty 11 or 12 or whatever. Little small things like this that can be pretty easily countered can also get very out of control very quickly if you don't take care of it. And it's definitely really cool when you get up close to it and you see this gigantic bug hole. It's pretty neat. And now let's talk about the new shovel. The shovel's definitely pretty neat. Me and my friends were goofing off with it and having some fun. At one point, we dug up just a big hole and filled it with mines and then lured some automatons into it. I mean, the issue I have with the shovel is that it just isn't very practical. It takes forever to actually dig a decent sized hole. So digging a hole to give yourself some cover isn't too useful unless you try to plan out an attack ahead of time. You definitely aren't going to be able to pull out the shovel and dig a decent sized hole in the middle of a gunfight, which is realistic. I just wish the digging process was just a tad faster. It also definitely has some wonkiness to it. Digging a hole can sometimes mess up your screen and you can see through the map and get some visual glitches. There's also a limit to how deep you can dig. In case you were curious, you can't just dig forever. The shovel can also be paired with the Ballistic Shield and used as a melee weapon if you want to do that, but it does take up your heavy weapon slot, so keep that in mind. And overall, I think the shovel is a pretty decent idea. It's definitely fun, it's just only useful when you're facing the automatons. Digging yourself a trench to hide can give you some good cover against some gunfire, but when you're going up against the Illuminate with all the voteless or the Terminids, they're just going to charge straight into your hole, and then you're just trapped in a hole with a bunch of enemies, so good luck with that. But the shovel is definitely a nice little surprise. I like what the devs did here, and I hope that they keep thinking outside the box like this in the future. So that's going to do it for my thoughts on the latest update for Helldivers 2. Overall, I think it was a pretty good patch. I don't really have any complaints, and they did a pretty good job. It definitely had a lot of unexpected changes for the better, and I definitely think this was a pretty good update, and I had a lot of fun going and testing everything out. But that's going to do it for everything in today's video. Let me know what you think of the latest patch down in the comment section down below. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button and hit the bell for notifications. That way you don't miss out on any future Helldivers 2 videos. And that is going to do it for me, guys, and I will talk to you all next time.